Now I'm going to take a quick sidetrack from organics and ZBrush basics to go a little bit more box modelly. I used to hold off on ZModeler until much later in the course when we got into hard surface stuff, but what I found is people relied way too much on sculpting techniques and not enough on just box modeling creation techniques. And both are really, really useful, even for organic stuff, but especially for hard surface stuff, or even props or boots or pouches. All of these things are really useful or much faster created using box modeling techniques than trying to sculpt everything or using sculpting techniques to solve every problem in ZBrush. So we're going to go over some really quick ZModeler basics. We're going to get more in depth as the course goes on, but for now, just as an overview, what I like to do is I'll start out with, really you can start with any primitive. If you have the Polymesh 3D available, I like to use that because it's already a Polymesh 3D. If you turn on Polyframe here, you're going to see it's already a color. It's not like a primitive where it's white. It's just a green color. There's no initialize options like the other ones because, again, it is already a Polymesh 3D. So I can skip the part where I make a primitive and then make Polymesh 3D. And why I start with this one is because what I usually do is go down to initialize and turn it into a Q cube. So now we have a Q cube. We went over this a little bit earlier in some of the videos where you can like change the resolution, like say down to 1 and hit Q cube. If you leave it at 2, that's probably fine just as a shape to start out with. Like I mentioned before, on any of these sliders, you can just slide in a number or you can just tap and then type in a number. You can hit tab to go to the next one, tab to go to the next one, enter, and then you can hit Q cube. And now you'll get this, or you can hit Q sphere, Q grid, Q cylinder, doesn't matter. Now, just like when you're sculpting, if you tap X, that'll go across X symmetry. It'll toggle activate symmetry on, so you can use ZModeler in symmetry. And just like in the earlier video where we were talking about 3D components, we have points, we have edges, and we have faces. So if we go to our ZModeler brush, I have that assigned to Alt-Q, but you can go to BZM. And now if you hover over an edge, you're going to see you have edge selection, you have point selection, and you have face selection. Now I say selection, it's just hovering over there and it's telling it what component type options to bring up when you hit the spacebar key. So if I hover over an edge, I hit the spacebar, you're going to see I have edge actions available. If I hover over a face, I have polygon actions. If I hover over a point, we have point actions. So depending on what type of object you want to make, you're going to manipulate this object using those component options. For example, if I hover over this face, it's set to Q Mesh a Poly by default. If I tap spacebar, you're going to see Q Mesh is the action that I want to take on that face. The target is a single polygon, and then align 10 step. We'll get to this a little bit later. I'm going to go ahead and change that to align full step. And then if you let go of spacebar, now when we go here, we can Q Mesh a Poly out. And Q Mesh is essentially extruding a face. It's a little bit fancier than that, but for now, you can just use this to extrude a face. Now because we have it set to, again, hover over face, spacebar, a single poly, it's just going to, whatever face you're hovering over, it's just going to Q Mesh that poly out. Now the cool thing about Q Mesh is you can take this polygon and drag down, and it'll get rid of that and close off those holes. So you can go through here, you can Q Mesh these out. You can actually Q Mesh things out of existence if you want. Or you can Q Mesh things up the middle and they'll be stuck together. So if you hold down Shift to smooth, you're going to see those are going to be stuck, and you can Q Mesh two things next to each other. So if you hold down Shift, you're going to see it doesn't just extrude. If you hover over a face, you can change it from Q Mesh to extrude a single poly. You can pull this up and it looks like they're stuck together, but if you hold down Shift, you're going to see they're two separate objects, and this one doesn't really snap to anything. It just keeps going. But if you change it to Q Mesh, a single poly, that's going to stick to it. Now this is where that align full step comes into play. So with align full step selected, you're going to see it's going to snap straight up. However, if I change that to like align quarter step, it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4 before it goes back. And you can get that. So we can also just slide right through. You're going to notice that in the front here, we have all of these are blue. These ones are like a pea green. These are a light green. These are red. These are the groups that are starting to be created. So when we Q Mesh a poly, you're going to see it kind of creates its own poly grouping. If you start pulling out and then you tap Alt, it'll cycle through different polygroups. And where that comes in handy is if you go over here to our polygroup menu, and this one you already know because we talked about it a little bit, you can do group by normals, and all of these harsh angles, these 90-degree angles will be grouped because our default max angle is set to 45. Now the problem is, since this is a symmetrical object, but we have different polygroups on either side, we have purple and blue over here. So if we go to Q Mesh, instead of a single poly, we're going to go to polygroup all. And then if we try to Q Mesh this out, it will polygroup both on both sides because it has symmetry turned on. But if you turn X off and you do polygroup all, it's going to polygroup this side out. because it's just polygrouping blue. And again, you can tap Alt, and that'll cycle through different polygroups as you're pulling. So if you wanted to polygroup this side and this side, what you can do is remember there was geometry, modify topology, mirror and weld. If you do that, since this is right down the middle, if we turn on our floor plane, you see we're Z forward, Y up. So now we have symmetrical polygroups on both sides. So now if I go in here, even with X symmetry turned off, we can Q mesh polygroup all, and we can Q mesh both of those polygroups out. Now, if I hover over this face and we do Q mesh polygroup island, that's only going to polygroup or Q mesh this one side, because this whole polygroup section right here has nothing to do with this side over here. They're split by polygons that aren't purple. So this is an island, this is an island, this is an island, this is an island. Now, as I'm pulling those groups out, you're seeing they're starting to turn into a bunch of purple and pink. That's because as I pull this out, it's doing the same polygroup for every Q mesh. If you want to change that, again, just tap Alt after you pull out, and that'll go ahead and change those polygroups. So it's kind of up to you how you want to work. So go and undo that. You're also going to see, instead of Q meshing or extruding, you can inset a face. If you inset a single poly, it's just going to inset this one poly. If you turn on X symmetry, it's going to insert polys on both sides. So here we can inset. And you can just keep insetting this face if you want to. And then if you want to, you can hover over a face, go back to Q mesh. You can go to single poly or polygroup all, whichever one you want to do. And you can Q mesh this out, or you can Q mesh this way, or you can Q mesh this in if you want to. And if you undo all that, if you hover over a face and you do inset, instead of a single poly, do polygroup all. That'll go ahead and inset all of these polygroups because they're all blue, so it'll go ahead and inset all of them. And if you wanted them to inset them all as one solid piece, you can go inset polygroup all, inset region, and that'll go ahead and inset here. You can inset this region. Now you're going to notice if I inset over here and it gives me that width, if I just tap on this, you're going to see it's going to maintain that width every time I inset. So you can very quickly go through and inset polygroup all. And same thing with Q mesh. If you hover over a face and you say Q mesh polygroup all and you push it in this far and you want the other ones to match, just go through and tap, and it'll go through and just Q mesh exactly that exact same depth. Let's go ahead and undo that. And again, you can also just drag your undo slider if you want. Again, we're going to get more in depth on when we get to the hard surface stuff of how to tackle certain problems and shapes that you guys come up with as you decide what you want to model, how to maybe use ZModeler to achieve that. So I'm just going to go over a couple different options here. We're still on the polygon options here, so let's go ahead and do a bridge, connected polys. We'll go ahead and turn that to a circle, specified curvature of 100, specified resolution of 8, align to normal, triangle sides. And now you're going to see when I hover over this face, there's a little orange line that pops out. So if I want to bridge these two connected polys, I can choose this side with the orange and I can tap it, and that'll make a perfect circle with triangle sides right through here. And now you can talk about some of these options. So you can do this. If you turn off triangle sides, you do quad sides. Now it's 1, 2, 3, 4 per. I like triangle sides better. Align to tangent might still work. If you ever get a weird result though, align to normal behaves a little bit more predictably. If we do interactive resolution, when we press and pull, we can actually update that resolution on the fly. So if you didn't want 8, you could just dial that in by interactive. Same thing with curvature. You can do interactive curvature. So as you pull down, you can either bend that in or you can bend it out. And you can say, I want it to bend way out or less out. So depending on what you want to make, you can do it interactive or you can tell it what shape you want it to make. Now that was connected polys. If you want to do 2 polys, this one might be a little difficult. So what I'm going to do instead, I'm going to hover over this face. We're going to do Q mesh polygroup all, and I'm going to Q mesh this out. Now, when I'm pulling out, what I can do is I can hold down Shift, and that'll actually slide these faces along a surface normal. So I can start Q meshing this out, hold down Shift, and just push along that surface normal. This is really useful for just moving things around. But also, if you start Q meshing this out, and instead of holding down Shift, you hold down Control, that'll pop off this entire section. And then you can continue Q meshing this out. Same thing with this top one. You can Q mesh this, hold down Control, and then pop this out. Now, because we have Q mesh polygroup all, this is purple, this is purple. So what I tend to do is as I'm drawing this out, I'll tap Control and then Alt to give it a new polygroup. And now I can Q mesh polygroup all. You can also do, if you're having a problem with that, polygroup island. And I will just Q mesh these islands here. But now that I have this, what I can do is I can do hover over face, I can do bridge, 2 polys. I can tap a poly here and a poly there, and it'll bridge those two. Or this poly to this poly, or this poly to this poly. Now this one you might have to be careful because I'm not certain that those are actually welded together. So what I might do in this case instead is Q-mesh single poly, and we'll just pull that up, and you'll see how it snaps to the next poly group. Those are like, it's like glue. As I pull this out, it's going to want to snap. So if I make my brush size small, it goes through really quickly. If I make my brush size big, I can push back quite a bit before it gets rid of it. So something to keep in mind. Now let's talk about edge options really quick. If you hover over an edge, you can try doing a bevel. I think that's the default. So you can bevel an edge. And again, just because we've put this distance in there, you can just tap, and that'll go ahead and bevel with the same value. If you go to Insert Single Edge Loop, actually I don't think bevel was the default. I think that was something I had chosen earlier in the demo. You can insert a single poly here, or you can insert multiple edge loops like this. You just click and drag up. And you can also do interactive elevation. So you can insert and bend that out if you want to. And if you wanted to say bevel edge loop complete, to bevel this, and let's say you wanted to round this out, you can do insert multiple edge loops, interactive elevation, and then you can just pull this out and you can kind of round that corner out if you want to. And that's interactive elevation and resolution, so you don't have to like crank up that resolution a bunch if you don't want. You can keep it pretty simple. And if at any point you want to redo your polygroups here, all you got to do, or at least what I tend to do, is go over here and group by normals again, and then just change this at max angle to get as many of the different polygroups as I can that make sense. A few more common edge actions. So hover over an edge. One thing I'll do quite a bit is bridge 2 holes. So for example, in order to bridge 2 holes, what I'm going to do is hover over a face here, and we'll go ahead and do delete a single poly. And if you want to make, well, we'll try this. We'll delete a single poly, we'll delete a poly here, and then we'll hover over an edge, we'll bridge 2 holes with a spline. You can click on one edge of a hole, click on the other, and then just click and drag, and that'll update the resolution on the fly because we have interactive curvature, interactive resolution. You can do arcs, circles, tight round corners, all sorts of cool stuff. Let's get something that gives a little bit more of a predictable result here. So I'm going to go through here, I'm going to delete this poly and this poly, and then we'll bridge 2 holes here. And then as we bridge these, you're going to see it's just a spline. However, we can change this to tight round corners, and that'll make the corners behave a little bit differently. You can do circle, and that'll make it a little more circular. If you want to, you can do optimal curvature and optimal resolution with the circles. That'll give you a nice circle with the good resolution to keep everything nice and even, depending on that square. And it also doesn't even have to be like square to square. It can be square to open square, and it'll go ahead and resolve that, and we'll go ahead and switch these back to interactive. So we'll go from 1 square to like 3, and it'll actually figure out how to make those shapes work. Or we'll go like horizontal to vertical shape here. I mean, it probably isn't going to be too pretty, but it will try and figure it out for you. On the edge here, if we go back to bridge, connected polys, circle, 100 curvature, 8 resolution, triangle sides, we can go ahead and split that through here. And then we can hover over this point, and we can split this point here. And if we go back to this backside here and just tap, it'll make it the exact same size. And then if you hover this, we can split ring, and that'll make that nice and even around here. And we'll just tap that one. Now if we want, we can do Q-mesh, polygroup all. Now if we do polygroup all here, because I didn't hold down Alt, it went ahead and grabbed all these polygroups, which I really don't want. However, what you can do is you can hold down Alt and then paint where you want, what the polygons you want selected. Now when I Alt paint this, that's going to treat this, even if I do Q-mesh a single poly, even though there are multiple polygons, it's still going to treat it as one polygon because they're painted white. So I can go through here, I'm going to Q-mesh this in, I'm going to tap Alt to make it a new polygroup, and then I can do Q-mesh, polygroup all, and then hold down Control, and I can pop out a copy. So now I have a perfect cylinder that'll go right in here, and I can hover over this edge. And if I want to give these things triangle size, I can go hover over a point, and I can do bridge 2 points, and I can go ahead and bridge those points here. So now I should be able to get a bevel along this edge, although I forgot that I would have to go through, since this one had more resolution than this bottom one, I'd have to go through and do this. So that's kind of a bummer there, but you get the idea. So now I can bevel this top part here, And now I've got an extra piece. And just like anything else, you can go through, you can mask this object right here. You can invert that mask. We haven't gotten a gizmo yet, but we can go ahead and use a gizmo, and we can, fit objects right where they should go. And you can also use visibility. If you hold down Control-Shift, you can isolate this piece right here, Control-Shift-Drag to invert that. And if you want, you're like, you know what, I don't even want that piece anymore. Go over to Geometry, Modify Topology, Delete Hidden, and it's completely gone. Don't need it anymore. Now what I can do is I can take this Q-Mesh Polygroup All, and I can just pull this straight back, and it'll go through and cut right through the object because we had that identical polygroup here. So it's going to, Q-Mesh is going to snap right to it. And go ahead and sew that up for me. If I don't want this inside loop, I can hover over an edge, insert single edge loop, hold down Alt, and that'll get rid of it. So if you don't hold down Alt, it'll add an edge loop. If you do hold down Alt, it'll delete an edge loop. Of course, you can add edge loops in here. You can hover over an edge. You can do like polygroup polyloop. We'll make this a polyloop or a polygroup here. Tap Alt if you want to make it a different color. Q-Mesh Polygroup All, and we can pull this in, and now we've got a ring in there. And if you also want to, you can go through here, Q-Mesh a single poly, and then you can just get rid of any extra geometry you didn't want. Really, really easy, fundamental box model-y stuff. Speaking of polygroups and painting, if you wanted to, you can hover over an edge, and you can do polyloop, polyloop, polygroup, and that'll go ahead and cycle through a polyloop all the way around. You can also hold down Control-Shift with Select Lasso, select that edge, and it should go through, or at least try to, select an edge ring. And you can invert that, and you can hit Control-W to polygroup all visible, like we went over before. Another option is you can hold down Control-Shift, and you can grab just these front faces here with visibility. You can hit Control-W to make those all one polygroup. You can then go to the front here, go to your polygroup options. You can do Group Front, and then everything towards the camera will be grouped. You can change the angle on that one. You can also make it additive if you want to group front here and then group front here. Of course, you can go back to Group by Normals, and that'll go through and look at your normal angles and group accordingly. If you go to Auto Groups, anything that's not vert welded is going to get its own polygroup. That'll come in handy when we get to Insert Mesh Brushes. And even Group Mask, Clear Mask, if you wanted to do that, you can just mask something, hit Control-W, and that'll go ahead and group those. Or Visibility, you can just grab visible pieces, hit Control-W, and new polygroups. Or you can hit Control-W, make them all one polygroup, and you can go through here and you can hold down Alt, and you can paint. And then as you're painting, if you let go of Alt and then just keep tapping Alt, it'll go through and cycle through polygroups. So you can paint your own polygroups that way. If you want to get a little bit fancier, you can hold down Alt, start painting, tap Alt. That'll give you a new polygroup. And let's say we want to continue that. So what I'm going to do, if I hold down Alt and to start painting, it's going to inherit that polygroup. But let's say I accidentally tap Alt and give me a new polygroup. I'm like, so you know what? I wanted these two to be the same. You can try isolating just those two. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to like, okay, here's the red one, then we got this one, and we don't want this one here. And then we can hit Control-W. So we did that. Another option you can do is when you're painting, you can hold down Alt, and then if you let go of Alt, it'll go to another polygroup. If you tap Shift, it'll inherit that polygroup. So now if you just keep dragging, it'll just drag that polygroup here. So again, Alt, and then Shift to pick up this polygroup. So let's say we want these bottom ones to be red. Hold down Alt, start painting, Hold down Alt, start painting on this one, tap Shift, inherit the red, and then just keep painting. And then you can just keep painting that if you want to. If you want to grab this blue, hold down Alt, start painting, tap Shift, go over here, Alt, start painting, and now these are all going to be blue. And now that those are all blue, we can do Q-Mesh Polygroup All, and then those will behave similarly. Now, one more option I want to talk about with the ZModeler is close holes. And there is a caveat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this default, and if we go down here to the initialize, you're going to see this has H divides of 32. I'm going to go ahead and make that a Polymesh 3D. And then I'm going to go back to my cylinder, and I'm going to drop this H divides down to like 16. And now we'll go ahead and make a Polymesh 3D. So if I hold down Control-Shift, isolate that top, invert that, then delete hidden, that's Geometry Modify Topology Delete Hidden. Go to your ZModeler brush, BZM, hover over an edge, go to Close Convex Hole. When you click and you pull, you can see you have interactive elevation. Close convex hole, spline, again you can do circles, tight round corners, or whatever. And we also have interactive resolution here and interactive curvature. So as we're pulling to the left and right, we can go up and down, and then up and down we can get more or less resolution. Now this isn't going to work on cylinders like this. So another way to delete this flat area is you can hover over a face and you can go delete flat island, and then everything that's flat can get deleted. You can hover over face, you can go close convex hole. Now as you click and drag, you can add geometry, but you can't add height. So that's I'm not quite sure what the span count is. I think it's around 24, maybe it's 32, but I usually keep my divisions around 12 to 16, and higher than that, and I lose that interactive functionality. Just a few more things I want to addend to the end of this video. So I'm going to grab a Polymesh 3D, drag it on my canvas, go into edit mode, go all the way down here to the bottom to initialize, hit Q cube, and then with my ZModeler brush, BZM, we're going to hover over a face and we're going to do Q mesh, a single poly. So just pull one of these out here, and then I want to go ahead and make this a different color. So I'm going to hold down Alt and tap, and that's going to paint this one as a white. And then if I let go of Alt and keep tapping Alt, it's going to give it a new polygroup here. So now let's talk about inset. If I hover over a face here and we go to inset, polygroup all, region, I can inset this entire region. If I don't have region on, if you hover over a face and then hold down spacebar, go inset each poly, it'll do each poly just like this. However, I want to do this entire region, so I'm going to go into inset region. So I can inset this region and you can see everything's nice and square, it's inset perfectly. However, if I go over here and we do inset region, first of all, it's not going to do anything. The reason is there is no region, it's just a single polygon. So we have to go hover over this face here and then go to inset each poly. You can still keep polygroup all on, or you can go to single poly if you'd like. They should both still work. But as we go to inset here, you're going to see it's going to inset, but these sides on the left and right are thicker than the top and the bottom. So what you can do is, as you're dragging this down, if you hold down Shift, you're going to see it'll constrain it to a perfect square. So if that's what you want, that's something you can do. And this is useful if you want to like cut a hole in something. So on either side of these, we can hold down Alt and then let go, and then just keep tapping. And then you can just tap, and that'll go ahead and, well, you're going to have to hold down Shift and make it a perfect square on this side here. And then you can Q mesh these in. However, let's go ahead and undo that. What I'm really looking for is to keep our inset proportional. So if I hover over a face, and again we're doing inset, polygroup all, each poly, and I pull this in, hold down Control, and that'll go ahead and make that a proportional inset. And then back here, hold down Control, I'll also go ahead and Alt tap this one and mark it, and then hold down Control. There we go. And now I can do a Q mesh, polygroup island, pull this back, and then we can just go ahead and cut through if we'd like. And one thing I want to mention while we're doing hard surface modeling, not necessarily ZModeler specific, because when you're using ZModeler, you can go through here and you can ZModel and it's based on the surface normal. However, if you're ever in here with your gizmo and you want to move some of these things, what you can do is you can Alt, drag over these, and then you can hover over a face, say mask polygroup all, and then you can tap, and that'll go ahead and mask those polygroups. And you can Control tap to invert that mask. You can hold down Alt and tap here, and now you can move these things however you'd like. I mean, alternatively, you can also, you don't have to mask anything. You can Q mesh, polygroup all, and then hold down Shift, and it'll pull along the surface normal. But let's say you wanted to use the gizmo, you wanted to go to the side here and move it up a certain amount or something like that. Now the problem arises when we have perspective turned on and we start Alt tapping. It's going to look like it's going to go straight up and down, but it can be a little bit untrustworthy. So again, I hold down Alt and I tap over here, and it looks like it's going straight out or straight to the left. However, if I turn off perspective and I hold down Shift and snap, you're going to see the gizmo is kind of askew. So if you want to make sure that the gizmo is inheriting the proper surface normals, just model with perspective turned off, and now if you tap Alt and you hold down Shift and go to the side, it is perfectly aligned here. So you know it's always going to be perfectly straight.